Clinton, George W. Bush, Al Gore, John McCain, all of them favor the death penalty. And so does George Ryan, the governor of Illinois. But he called a halt to all executions in his state. Why? Because in Illinois, 13 men who had been sent to death row and spent years of their lives there were found later to have been wrongfully convicted. All of these men spent years on death row in Illinois waiting to die. And all of them were eventually set free when new evidence proved they had been wrongly convicted. Among them, Darby Tillis.
I spent 9 years, 1 month, 17 days in the penal system. Over 4 of those years was spent on death row waiting to die.
For the crime of?
Double murder, armed robbery, execution style.
But he didn't do it. Gary Gauger.
I was in prison for 3.5 years under the sentence of death for 9 months.
For?
Killing my parents.
He didn't do it either. Since Illinois reinstated its death penalty back in 1977, 12 men have been executed there. But in that same time, 13 others from death row were found to be wrongfully convicted. Moses Harrison is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Illinois.
We were sentencing innocent people to death, and it was inevitable that an innocent man was going to be executed. What could be more immoral than putting innocent people to death?
The Chief Justice says these men are a living testament to justice gone wrong. Take Dennis Williams. He lost nearly 2 decades of his life after being wrongly convicted. Williams was arrested with a group of young black men in 1978, immediately after the brutal murder of a young white couple.
I spent a total of 18 years in prison. I mean, literally in a cell, in a cage, about the size of probably the size of a bathroom.
And he would likely have been executed were it not for the investigation undertaken by this professor, David Protess, and his students at Northwestern University's journalism school.
They just locked up the first suspects that came along. And when they paraded them before television cameras and said that this terrible interracial crime had been solved, they weren't willing to look elsewhere.
Protess and his class did look elsewhere, and they found the actual killers, even obtained a confession. And those men went to prison, while Dennis Williams and the others went free. Not long after Williams went free, Professor Protess and his students got involved in another case, the case of Anthony Porter, who was on death row for 16 long years.
I was innocent all the time, and I know police that framed me because they know that I was innocent all the time. And I spent all that agony and that hell, and I'm still trying to get myself together.
Anthony Porter was 2 days away from execution. They'd fitted him for his burial suit. They'd asked him what he wanted for his last meal. They'd asked his family what they wanted to do with his remains. His life was virtually over.
Just 48 hours from the execution chamber, Porter was granted a last-minute stay, allowing Protess and his students to further examine the case over a 5-month period.
What did your students and you find?
I had the students go to the park where the eyewitness said that he saw Porter do the shooting. And they stood where the eyewitness claimed to be standing, and all they saw was a black wrought iron fence. Couldn't have seen what he testified to.
The star witness recanted, and the students eventually tracked down the real shooter in Milwaukee, who eventually confessed. Porter was freed last year, cleared of all charges.
Hell, torture. I can't even hardly see now. I've been locked up so long. They hurt me. They took my life. They destroyed my life like I want nothing.
And one of those most moved by his story was the newly elected Illinois Governor, George Ryan. On January 31st of this year, Governor Ryan, a Republican who supports the death penalty, announced he was halting all executions in Illinois, the first moratorium in the country.
And until I can be sure with moral certainty that no innocent man or woman is facing a lethal injection, no one will meet that fate. When you're the final stop, when you're the fellow that says, we're going to inject this person and put him to death, then you have to have a clear conscience, you have to be able to live with yourself, and you have to know that that's the case.
So what had gone wrong with the justice system in the state of Illinois? Investigation showed that many of those sentenced to death were represented by lawyers who were grossly incompetent. Some prosecutors were found to have engaged in misconduct. Some evidence was found to be inaccurate, phony. And there was a lot of untrue testimony from jailhouse snitches who testified only to get their sentences reduced.
But you can imagine it. 33 people on death row in Illinois were represented in defense by attorneys that had either been disbarred or suspended from the practice of law.
Now, how the dickens does that happen?
I don't know how
in the state of Illinois.
How does it happen anyplace, but how does it happen here?
Some of these people were testified against by jailhouse snitches who got better treatment or shorter sentences for talking about these people.
46 people were put on death row as a result of jailhouse informants. Tell us a little something about Mike, and we'll give you 10 years off your sentence.
Darby Tillis and Perry Cobb spent nearly a decade in prison, 4 years on death row, before a judge exonerated them, calling the testimony against them so unbelievable that it was, quote, almost an insult to humanity. And one of the judges who sentenced the men is now in prison himself, Thomas Maloney, found guilty of taking bribes in return for his leniency in 3 other death penalty cases.
There's never been a judge in the state of Illinois have went to prison for taking innocent men and sending them to jail. They sent him to jail because he was taking money. That shows that money is more valuable than human life in the state of Illinois.
And there is another problem in death penalty cases in Illinois: race. In at least 35 Illinois cases, black inmates have been sentenced to death row by all-white juries.
How many of you were found guilty by all-white jurors? 5 of you. Does the fact of being black, in your estimation, make it easier for the prosecutors to go after you?
They jump on it when you say black.
They used and abused Ms. Cobb and myself to make a statement that black on white crime was not going to be tolerated.
Gary Gaga, how come you're the only white man in here?
Just lucky, I guess.
The only one invited.
It happens to white people, too.
Gary Gauger was incarcerated for more than 3 years, 9 months of it on death row, convicted in the savage killing of his own parents on the farm where they lived.
Their throats were cut so badly they practically severed their heads.
Gauger had no history of violence, yet he was instantly the prime suspect in the murders. Police questioned him for 18 straight hours without a lawyer. They said he confessed.
I never confessed. The police manufactured a confession. No evidence was ever established against me. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before finding me guilty, and I was subsequently sentenced to die.
Gauger gained his freedom only after another professor from Northwestern University took up his case. Members of a motorcycle gang eventually confessed to the crime. And things hardly look up for these men after they get out of prison. Most difficult for them, finding a job.
How many of you have jobs now? Just 3 of you.
I was a professional entertainer, making pretty nice money.
Can't get a job?
I ain't getting no job. That is hooked on you the rest of your life. They say that you are innocent until proven guilty. That's a capital BS. Anytime that you got to be locked up and taken back and forth to court, how can you be innocent in jail?
To be put on death row and treated as an animal, to have your very soul scarred, it compromises your competence to even hold a job.
And beyond that, what about compensation for the years of their lives squandered wrongfully in prison?
Men who've spent years, long time in death row, innocent, should be compensated for the time they spent?
Sure.
You do believe that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a long time out of your life. To be innocent, sitting behind bars, they ought to be compensated very well.
But of the 13 men who've been exonerated, most have never received a penny of compensation, and many are cynical about it, like Rolando Cruz.
You can't compensate a man when you have erased his life. Let me erase some of your life, some years of your life. Let me erase years of the governor's life. You can't compensate. That's an insult.
For Cruz and a number of the other men, the final insult is that before they could be compensated, they must ask the state for a pardon.
They tell me that I have to ask for a pardon for a crime I never committed. I ain't gonna ask for no pardon. Pardon means forgive me, excuse me, I'm sorry. No, you're crazy.
One of these men has received money. Dennis Williams filed a wrongful prosecution suit against Cook County. He was represented by attorney Jerry Spence and received a settlement of more than $12 million.
For being falsely accused, for being kidnapped, for having my very soul raped.
And even the basic question of innocence still haunts these men, according to some Illinois prosecutors.
Mr. Chief Justice, some of the prosecutors have told us that, yes, folks have been exonerated, they've gone free, but chances are that more than a couple of them are, in fact, guilty.
That's just not accurate. There were actual claims of innocence. And there was DNA evidence that proved there was innocence. There were statements made by other people confessing to the crime.
Governor Ryan's moratorium has sparked a reevaluation of the death penalty across the United States. Texas Governor George W. Bush, whose state has executed more than a third of all those killed in the U.S. since 1977, was recently asked about the subject and had this to say.
I'm confident that every person that has been put to death in Texas under my watch has been guilty of the crime charged.
When you hear George Bush, the governor of Texas, say that he's absolutely certain, he is satisfied that those people who have been put to death during his term as governor were guilty, are you skeptical?
There were jurors and judges in Illinois that were absolutely certain that men were guilty. And they were wrong 13 times. Yes, I'm skeptical.
You think it's possible, Governor, that innocent individuals have been put to death here in the state of Illinois?
We'll certainly have to wonder about it when we've got 13 out of 25, Mr. Porter 2 days away from death. So I would imagine that that's a possibility. I hate to think about it, but it's probably true.
Governor Ryan's moratorium is having an impact now in Washington. Just this past Wednesday, the first bill calling for a nationwide moratorium, a halt to executions all across the country, was introduced in the U.S. Senate by Senator Rusk Feingold of Wisconsin.